Hi, gamers. Welcome to a quick interview with one of our competitive players here in our local tournament scene in the Lehigh Valley. I'm meeting here with Mark. Mark, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey guys, I'm a competitive player that's been in 40K for, probably like 15 years, but only recently started doing competitive for the past 3 or 4 years, and mostly focused on Tyranids. That's basically me.
That's him. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
That's all. I was just saying.
No, that's perfect, Mark. Now, we asked this question of everyone who jumps in this interview. Convince me that you are the biggest nerd in the world. It can be a 40K nerd or just a nerd in general, but prove to me that you are one of the biggest nerds.
Oh my god. So, as we all know, 40K is really expensive. But what if we had two expensive hobbies? So I do both Magic the Gathering and 40K, and probably takes up the majority of my time. So I do that. I play a lot of RuneScape. Just gotta get back to the old school MMOs. Played the back when I was in like 5th grade. I basically don't do anything besides be a gamer. Do a lot of painting and hobbying, and then also do engineering as my main job. So nothing but nerd activities.
That sounds about right to me. I don't know how you have time to do all this stuff.
Oh, I don't.
And still be a competitive player. You did say that you've been a competitive player for the last 3 or 4 years. How do you define being a competitive player?
Oh my god. For the most part, if you're considering yourself as like a competitive 40K player, you're mostly thinking about like, how am I going to win games? So the whole point of the game is a battle of wits, a competition between two people on the tabletop. So really at the heart of it, being a competitive player, is your main goal is you want to win a game. And now the method at which you go about winning that game can take many different forms, but at the heart of it, that's really what you're trying to do.
So what got you into that? I mean, playing a game in general, you always want to win, right? So what interests you in specifically competitive?
So like the difference between competitive play and casual play, like when you're more casual, you're trying to live out more of a story, or you have like this different mindset about what you're trying to achieve. A lot of times it's you want cool moments, you want to do maybe some wacky objective within a game. You might be playing Crusade, you want to tell a specific story about your army and how you're playing that game and fulfilling a larger narrative. But for like a competitive play, when it's for me, I always like competing. So seeing if I can outsmart my opponent through outthinking their plays, and in general, just how much of a testing my skill at the game to overcome any challenges that might come up. And 40K is a pretty good one because it's just because of how open-ended it is, unlike other games like Magic, where it's a little more binary, where you have defined moves and actions that you can make. Like you have a defined number of cards you can draw. There's a specific amount of like mana you can spend on spells. Whereas 40K is more what I would call analog, where the amount of movement you're working in a 3-dimensional space and you're moving models around, but it's not like you have like defined squares where you're moving models. Everything is the number of permutations that you can of your decisions that you can make in a game. It grows exponentially, basically infinite, as you play this complex game. So there's many different ways or many different things that can happen over the course of the game. And there's also a lot more things of chance going on, whereas some other games might be more limited. In 40K, every time you roll the dice, that is something undefined or something unknown that's going to happen, and you have a certain percentage of chances of a certain action occurring or whatnot. So it's a lot of balancing expectations versus reality and adapting on the fly, which makes it a lot more fulfilling when you actually win.
Mm-hmm. So I have to ask you this. You've rolled enough dice in your lifetime. Do the dice win you the game or lose you the game, or how much of an impact do the dice have on the actual outcome of it?
It depends. So depending on your strategy, like if you're relying on a low number of dice rolls, the dice are going to have a greater effect on it because you have less rolls to get a expected average over the number of dice you roll. Whereas if, let's say, you've got a unit that's rolling 100 shots, well, you're going to be much closer to the average that you would expect versus if you're rolling like one, because you're either going to get one hit or no hits. So 0 or 100% versus the 50% average, which you would if you're hanging on like a 4+. When you think about dice, like over the course of the game, the numbers you roll on those dice is going to even out. But when those specific numbers show up, it can be almost anything. Like maybe the one time you roll all the sixes is during your psychic phase, and all of a sudden you perils a whole bunch. It's the more you can streamline those dice rolls, the better consistency you would have. So even if you think like, hey, I'm rolling terribly, well, odds are maybe somewhere else you rolled a whole bunch of sixes where it didn't really matter, so you didn't really notice it. But overall, I would, even though it might come up in the heat of the moment, overall it's not. I don't think dice play all that much of a role in what you do.
No, that makes sense. Although I swear my dice are either great or bad. So you and I can agree to disagree on that, but good insight. Yeah, the more dice you roll, the more it will hit that average as opposed to that one-off where it's either 100% or 0%, even though the odds are 50. That's a great point. Now, thinking back on your illustrious 40K competitive career, what was your biggest accomplishment? What are you most proud of?
Oh boy. I wouldn't call it illustrious, but maybe in our small little area. But probably what was the best I did was the last Adepticon that occurred. I got 12. I think I got 12th overall with Mono Tyranids, and that was the event where Jim Vessel got his name. So that's where he won Adepticon and went on a winning streak throughout the rest of the competitive season. And I did that at the point where Tyranids didn't have anything but their main codex. They didn't have any of the Psychic Awakening. We just had the double Kraken Stealers with Swarmlord combo, and I managed to get 12th place. So that felt pretty good, because it was my first major ever getting there. So I would say that's probably the best. And then the 2 weeks after, we did BFS for the team event. And though it's a team event, so you choose your matchups. I did go, like was it 6 rounds? I think I went 5-1 over the course of that weekend with Tyranids.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's really neat. Can you tell us more about your Adepticon experience when you went 12? Like, do you know how many people were playing? And for those that haven't been to a big major like Adepticon, what that was like?
So Adepticon's a little more unique. They have day 1 is 4 rounds, and after that they cut to top 16, and then there's 4 more rounds the next day. I think they usually cut it off it's a flat 255 or 256 players. So if you go 4-0, you're going to day 2. So I did go 4-0, so I did make day 2, and then they count down from there. It's a long day. It's a very long day. And at least at that time, this was before they started standardizing all their missions. So Adepticon had their own homebrew, like all the other major events at that time did, of missions. Mm-hmm. And they also had probably one of the only instances of player-placed terrain. So that was an interesting time because it was probably one of the only times you had to do player place terrain and their own unique version of missions.
Was it 7th edition or 6th?
This was 8th.
Oh,
it was 8th.
it?
It was so. This was the last Adepticon that got hosted before COVID canceled everything.
Wow.
Was it 2000? I guess it had to be 2019.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just curious because I thought they were already using more standard missions by then, by 8th, but I'm mistaken. I didn't realize they were doing their own missions even in 8th. I thought it was 7th.
Yeah, no, they were doing that because like you had the ITC missions throughout all 8th. It wasn't until we hit 9th edition that everyone became standardized.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Nova had their own missions. ITC had or Frontline Gaming Events had their own missions. Adepticon had their own, and I don't remember if maybe the one of the tournament circuits in the South had their own missions too.
The ATC, is it? Is the Atlanta?
Oh yeah. ATC did have their own missions. They had like their own version that was like a combination of Maelstrom and something else I can't remember. But I think like there's like this Atlanta. Oh man, I can't remember. But I remember there's at least a whole bunch of different majors and events that had their own missions. But thankfully, we now live in an era where we have one mission packet and we can expect to play the same thing everywhere.
Yeah, I really appreciate it too, because I think that was one of the challenges when I got into competitive play. Was first I learned the ITC missions because my goal was to go to the LVO, and through doing that, I kind of really pushed for it in this area. But I avoided tournaments that didn't have the ITC format just because, as a beginner competitive player, it was hard enough for me to grasp the missions and the game than to start varying the missions on top of it, which is a shame because, I mean, I do enjoy different mission formats, but at the time I was still pretty green, so it was good for me to keep consistent.
Yeah, especially just how utterly complex this game is, and even more so in 9th. Having only one mission packet makes it at least limits some of the variables. Because it's at this point in time, even for other competitive players, like it's a lot of information taken, and even now it's hard to keep up with.
I agree. Now, if you could go back in time, and I'm talking about when you start in 40K, maybe not even when you start being competitive, but it's up to you. What advice would you give yourself?
Oh boy. So I would say at the very least, don't blame the dice. Don't do that. I would also say like whenever you're building a list, whenever you're figuring out how you want to play a game, you always have to think, how am I winning this? You want to start with how am I going to win this game? And that always starts with how am I scoring points? What are the objectives of the game? What was the path to victory? So if you're thinking about a 9th edition mission, you want to say, okay, how am I scoring primary? What secondaries am I going to focus on? And once you start there, you know how to build a list to accomplish those. That way you have a baseline strategy of like, this is how I'm going to score points, and then I can adapt to whatever opponents I'm facing. That at least will help focus you on what you're doing and narrow the amount of choices you have to make when you're both playing the game and designing a list.
Are there any other tips you would give a new player just starting to tippy toe into the competitive scene? Because I know a lot are afraid of losing, getting blown off the table, etc. Any tips you would give them on top of what you had just said?
So don't be afraid of losing. Losing is how we all learn. And with how complex this game is, you basically should expect to lose almost every single game the first time you go out. Because there's going to be a lot of details that you don't know. That's totally understandable. We have 20 plus factions. Each one has a monstrous rulebook going along with it. And we all have this hidden data called stratagems that isn't right in front of you. It's not in the data sheet. So there could be, depending on your opponent, you might have some gotchas, even if they try to explain it. just expect that, hey, you're going to lose, but you're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn how your army is supposed to act. You're going to learn what your faction excels at, what it's bad against, how other armies play. You're going to learn how to interact with other people, how to ask questions. One of the biggest things that I had to learn was when you get up to a table and you see your opponent's army, there are certain key questions that you're going to want to ask, like what their you basically want to like what kind of movement shenanigans can you do? Can you do redeploys? What you might want to ask, like, okay, what are your 3 most expensive units? If you want to know what the last target's going to be. There are some leading questions that you can do, basically figure out what the army is capable of and help you figure out what their general game plan is going to be. Like if I was going against Thousand Suns, I would want to know what are some of the different powers you can do, what kind of debuffs can you do to me, what are the range on your powers, so you can play around the angles, how many redeploys or redeep strikes can you do. It lets you at least understand what your opponent is capable of, so that you can plan your own strategy around that.
That's great advice. I really appreciate it. And Mark, thank you for sharing your insight on really what you enjoy about competitive play and how new competitive players can get into the scene. Now I'd like to change to the topic you're really here for, as I'm sure today, your first day back in the office, someone leaked what looks like the entire Tyranid Codex. And being a Tyranid player, you must have been heartbroken that you got a chance to see it today. So, first appearance, first look, what's your initial reaction?
Oh, my Jesus. This codex is something else. So, first off, it is absurdly complex. There are so many different choices you can make between. There's a lot of different command phase buffs, so a lot of the synapse creatures now have different buffs they can place on units during the command phase. The synaptic links are no more. Instead, they introduced a monofaction bonus where each battle round you choose a bonus to apply to all units within range of your synapse creatures based on what kind of synapse creatures you have. So the composition of what units you take affects which ones you can select. It's like if you had, imagine if you were playing Necrons, but the different protocols you could choose were the only ones you could choose were based on what units you took. Like each synapse creature gives you access to a specific buff that goes across your arm. It's called a synaptic imperative, essentially.
Yeah, and keep in mind, just for the audience, that these are leaks. They may or may not be true. Yeah. We're just based on what we ran across. But that's interesting. Tell me more.
From what it looks like, it in the format of the images and what it looks like, it very much seems like it's going to be true. But I haven't run across anything that seems unbelievable. Like all the language is correct. The format of the images seems correct. They line up with a whole bunch of other leaks that came out. So for the time being, I would assume that it is almost entirely true.
There is one thing that gives me cause for concern, and that's that it might make Tyranids good. And I don't think that can be possible. No, I'm just kidding. I'm excited for you and this codex.
The only thing I'm concerned about is I hope to God that Crusher Stampede is not legal. Because if it is...
Really? That's going to be a good combo with the new updates?
I think it would break... The Crusher is already good, but with the things that come in this codex, if Crusher is still legal, I think it would just break things in half. Like there's most of the monsters, the ground-based ones, so the ones that are just walking, got a lot more wounds. A lot of them are T8, a lot of them 2-up save. So you combine that with that -1 damage at 5 invuln. You can't kill anything. It's going to be nearly impossible to kill any of your units. They also have way more higher damage output, and unlike the higher duels that are typically taken or the Daimas, you can hide them all because they're all sub 18 wounds. But in general, there's a lot of different buffs you can take. There's a lot of choices in your units because of the synaptic imperatives. There's also many different like actions you can perform to get different buffs. There's a lot of movement shenanigans. As a Tyranid player, that is sort of the crux of the army, being able to have a lot of different redeploys and movement and get to places that your opponent doesn't want you to be. Across the board, all the stat lines became amazing. Like, it feels like every unit has its place. Everyone does something unique, so it's crazy. It's just trying to absorb all the information has been tough over the course of the day. I did make a initial list for something with Kraken just to have a baseline. Like, okay, what does it look like? Because it's all well good to look at all these crazy buffed up units, but like, what can you actually fit in the list? As much as everything got buffed, their points also went up. So Gaunts, according to this codex, Gaunts have gone up 40% in points. So they went from 5 points to 7 points. You got Gargoyles and Horror that are 8 points each. So you're paying a hefty price for these pretty flimsy units. But they're the things they could do is a lot better. So you're overall, you're probably gonna have less models on the board, but they're gonna be better at what they do. So you have to pick and choose where you go from there.
So Tao's really been a hit the meta with the Storm, as well as even Custodes, even though not as much. They've been able to hold their own ish with Tau. Do you feel that this really shakes up the meta? I know it's early, just a quick snapshot, but do you feel it easily blows Tau and Custodes out of the water? Do you think it gives them a run for their money, or do you still think that Tau and even Custodes may still be a little too hot compared to this codex?
So the nice thing about Tyranids is, so one of the key things is that their high fleet traits, they have 2 buffs. So you've got two bullet points for each synaptic adaptation. And one of them is labeled as adaptive. And what the adaptive one is, you can, at the beginning of the first battle round, after you know who goes first, but before it begins, you can swap that out. So you can just completely be like, all right, you know what? I'm going second. I'm gonna swap this out for this one.
Wow!
So you just completely swap out.
That's insane.
Yeah, it's you. So you can really customize to your opponent. That seems to be the main focus of the book is to focus on the adaptivity of Tyranids versus their opponents.
But that adds to the complexity, like you were saying, because now you're making game time decisions. We're actually putting out a stream tomorrow, so by the time you're hearing this, it's already came out. We're going to talk about list building for beginner competitive players. And one of the things we're going to talk about is simplifying the list when you're newer, right? Because when you're a newer competitive player, you have too many things to think about. You want to simplify it, but the more powerful lists, when you think of Gene Stealer Cult, when you think of, it sounds like with Tyranids and some of the other builds, the added ability to choose. What used to be when you chose relics before the game started, which they took away, they're adding more choice before the game, which, say, think of Monka and Kayon, even though it's an easy decision for Tau. The more decisions you have to make makes you both more powerful, but also could cause you into analysis paralysis, or burn your brain out so you can't focus as well.
Yeah, no, it's there's so much choice. And Tyranids has always been a faction where there's a lot going on, and because you have the synapse creatures and that are sort of the focal points of your army that your units revolve around, it's always been a lot of you're trying to synergize the units you have together. They're trying to work together. It's not like you have one unit that goes off and does its own thing, which you could, but the army is meant to play as a whole network of units together. And nothing is more true than looking at this codex. You've got, they've shown that there's a lot more focus on synapse creatures. They made the range of synapse shorter, so it's only 6 inches now. Which is so it's really short. So it's basically saying we want you to have your synapse creatures close by, and they need to get up close and personal. A lot of the codex is based on making your close combat better, making your movement in combat, or getting around your opponents better. So it's really focusing on you being in combat, getting there quickly, and then comboing all your buffs together based on the location of your units to each other. So, like, one of the things that they do is with synaptic links. So, sort of like how they had before, but instead of being a command phase buff that goes across, what a lot of the abilities will say, hey, you can select this unit within X inches of this, or within synaptic link range of this unit. So let's say there's like some of the psychic powers will say, hey, I can have this guy all the way in my backfield, and I can cast this power on an enemy unit all the way up there because I've chained it through all of my synapse creatures.
I mean, that's a lot of movement shenanigans. You have to plan just perfectly, and you're exposing yourself in many ways. But that's fantastic.
Yeah, so like you have to. That's there's really a lot of. You have to be really good at at thinking about all the different pieces you have on the board and how they're going to work together, and having a game plan in your mind for all your different units as you go through your turn. So there's going to be a lot of pre-planning you're going to need to do. There's a lot of forethought, but if you're able to master that, it's going to be powerful.
That's really cool. Now, what do you feel? I know it's still early on, but is the strongest aspect of the Codex?
It's just looking at it. It's the adaptivity, like being able to adapt to your opponent's game plan is probably the most powerful thing. There's a lot of. Actually, let's go back to talk about the Hive Fleet adaptations. So, if you think about the adaptations you select, like the Hive Fleet, you choose. There's 3 categories of secondary adaptations you get to choose from. So, when you take the trait that you take out that's labeled as adaptive that you get to swap out, there are 3 columns. It's called like Lurk, Feed, and I forget what the other one is called. Each column has I think 5 different adaptations, and depending on what Hive Fleet you select, you only get to swap out for 2 of those columns. So the third one of the columns you're not going to be able to choose from. So you're gonna want to look at what your Hive Fleet is, what the base trait is that you always get to keep, and what you could select out from, and you can see what you can adapt to. One of the things I really like is the column for Lurk. So Lurk has a lot of the more defensive stuff. As you can probably imagine, like your Lurk is more, you're saying like, I'm being defensive, I'm holding back. So there's things that like you count as double wounds for degrading, make your monsters OBSEC. It's not like Crusher where you count as the number of models equal to your wounds remaining. You only count as 5 if you have 10 or more wounds. Otherwise, you're just 1 model. But still, you get to be OBSEC. There's one where you're like, I get +1 to cast Deny, and you have an extended range for your psychic powers. So imagine like, hey, I'm going to go up against Thousand Suns. +1 to die for my whole army. Thank you very much.
That's pretty good.
So,
so you can be Grey Knights for a hot second.
Well, this applies for the rest of the game. You choose at the start. You choose at the start of the first battle round, and it replaces your Hive Fleet, one of your Hive Fleet traits.
That's cool. That's pretty.
It's
cool.
gross. So you basically you can basically set up your Hive Fleet to be whatever based on whatever the best in the meta is at the time, and then from there know like, okay, in this matchup I'm going to choose this, in this matchup I'm going to choose this, and you'll at least can have a game plan for adapting to each opponent so you're better equipped.
Nice. Great. Well, Mark, any last thoughts? Anything you want to leave the audience with before we end this discussion?
Oh boy, there's so much to talk about. If you're thinking about going into competitive play, don't be afraid to go into it. What the internet says about it being a whole bunch of neckbeards that harass you and rules lawyer you to oblivion, that's not true. The majority, it's like any other social situation. The majority of people you're going to meet are people that just like you, trying to play the game and have a good time. And just like any other situation, you're going to have those couple of bad apples that you're gonna have a bad time against. But this is like any time in life, you're gonna friend those kinds of people. And you can always fall back on the Tormentor guys or the other people around you to help mitigate some of those problems and recover from it. But after the game, you can always just shake it off and just move on. Because really, we're just playing with toy soldiers. It's not a life or death situation. We're doing this for fun. You don't have to worry too much about it.
Listen, Mark, it's all fun and games until I lose, just so you know.
Well, if you just stop playing,
but no, it's a great point.
Stop playing Tau. Everything will get better.
Hey, that hurts. That hurts. We have our moment in the spotlight for like a hot month, and I haven't even played a tournament yet.
You have betrayed the Forearmed Emperor. I know you've got
I have betrayed
some guys back there.
I betrayed everyone. I betrayed Tau for the Four-Armed Emperor. I betrayed the Four-Armed Emperor for Chaos. And now I've betrayed everyone to go back to Tau. So, you know. That's the story of my life, Mark. Hey, thank you so much for your time. This has been great. Gamers, go ahead and if you have any questions for Mark or us that you want to know more about competitive play, go ahead and comment on this interview or jump in our Discord or Facebook page. Everyone, thank you so much. Make it a great day.